Our chapter 12, we're looking at how humans behave in a social context. And as at this point in the semester, we've talked a lot about the fact that humans are social creatures. We say this over and over again. We evolved very directly because of our societies. As groups got larger and larger, a lot of people view that as what pushed us to having such large brains. Having larger brains and more complex connections actually gave us the processing power to be able to track larger and larger social groups. And living in larger groups allowed us to survive better and specialize in sort of different things because we were working together and cooperating. So there's a lot of really, really interesting sort of evolutionary theories that tie into that. And the fact that our social nature is very, very critical to how we evolved and the behaviors we exhibit. And we're going to see a lot of that kind of weaving through this chapter. But yeah, we're going to start looking at sort of our perception of others, how we can influence others, and how we act towards others, and a lot of different things in between. But the starting point here is we're going to be looking at some of our social thinking and perception, specifically looking at attribution as our starting point, where typically we start with a definition, where attributions are judgments about the causes of our own and other people's behaviors and the outcomes. So why did this thing happen? So if I'm attributing that outcome to a particular behavior, a particular action, or a particular quality, I'm trying to explain why that occurred. So did I do well on the midterm because I studied really hard, or is it because the test was really easy? What's the reasoning here? What are we attributing this to? And the way that we frame things, these attributions, can dramatically affect our subsequent behavior and our emotions in relation to those situations. So if I have framed it where I did really well on that test because I studied really hard, or because I'm really smart, that's something that might give me some self-confidence. I am now more certain in my own abilities because this outcome is supporting those the claims, those traits that I now say that I have. So that can be really, really important. If we are attributing things to others, if we're looking at, say you have a friend and you were supposed to meet for coffee and you're sitting there and they are 15 minutes late and you haven't heard from them. So maybe you make an attribute of, well, it's rush hour, they're probably stuck in traffic. So you're going to be a lot more understanding when they show up. You're going to be like, hey, they're finally here, I'm so glad, how was it, are you okay? Whereas if you look at it and go, oh, well, it's this friend and they're always late, they're probably late because of their personality, because they didn't leave on time, because they're always late, we're probably going to be a lot angrier about that situation. So in both cases, you're sitting in the same place 15 minutes late for a date, and we have two possible framings. The framing then affects how we interpret and react to that situation. So again, we're getting into one of those very psychological type things where we have these fairly logical concepts, but we're giving them proper names and trying to explain why they might happen and why they're so important to us. And that's where we get into our attribution theory. So this is specifically when we're trying to look at interpreting the behavior of others. So we're trying to explain why someone has behaved a particular way. What is driving this particular situation? So in our example here, the behavior that we're looking at is Jane is late for work. Suppose if I had thought to look ahead when I gave my example of a friend being late for your coffee date, it's very, very similar here. But we're saying that this person, Jane, is late for work. And we have two types of explanations. We can have an internal explanation or an external explanation. Our internal explanations are based on the internal qualities possessed by our person we're trying to explain. So Jane, we are explaining her internal motivations, what's going on here. We might call that a dispositional explanation. So we are looking at Jane's disposition, things like her personality and how she tends to behave. So our explanation would be that Jane is irresponsible. She left late. She didn't set an alarm. She didn't plan for traffic. There is something wrong with Jane, and that is what we're using as our attribution here. That's our explanation of this scenario. We've gone with something internal and therefore dispositional. In contrast, we might have gone with an external or a situational explanation. So that external meaning something outside of Jane's control. So the situation is what's to blame rather than Jane herself. So Jane might be stuck in traffic, or Jane might be having car problems. Something might have gone wrong. So in this situation, it's less of a I blame that person and their personality and their disposition, but I blame these external situations that are out of our control. And so, of course, if we have these two conflicting ideas, two different ways to frame this, how the heck do we actually decide which one is correct? And as per usual, we have theories on how we make this decision. So the first is proposed by Harold Kelly, and this is a fairly old theory. This was proposed in '73, and yet it has still sort of kicked around in various forms, which is why we mention it. But it's going to say that we're going to consider 3 different types of information to figure out what kind of a determination or what kind of an explanation we're going to rely on. So we're going to look at consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus, which apparently I cannot pronounce today. But we have a new example here. I borrowed this one from another one of my textbooks, mostly because the person that we're evaluating is named Kim. And so in this situation, our behavior, so instead of Jane being late for work, we have Kim who says that this art class is boring. And so we want to evaluate consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus. Those are our 3 different attributional factors. These are the 3 things that Kelly wants us to focus on. So for consistency, is this something that Kim says often? So for high consistency, when asked, Kim always says that art is boring. So if it is inconsistent, then this is probably something that isn't long-term. This isn't something that's stable. So if we have low consistency, which isn't an example in this chart here, low consistency would be Kim's probably having a bad day today. This is a one-off situation. This doesn't often happen. This is a special situation. So we're probably not going to have those same deeper attributions because it isn't something that consistently happens. So for us to get into a proper attribution, we want it to be consistent, so high in consistency. Next, we get into distinctiveness. So how does this situation compare to other situations that this same individual has been in? So Kim is complaining about this art class. What does she say about the other classes that she takes? If we have low distinctiveness, well, Kim is saying that all of her classes are boring. So it's not just this one class, it's all classes. That's something to consider. Or we can have high distinctiveness, where this is the only class that's boring, all the other classes are fine. Those are 2 very, very different framings, but we're going to store that information and continue, because now we want consensus. So what do other people say? What is the environment telling us? So other students say that the class is great. That would be that there's low consensus. Our individual has an opinion and it differs from everyone else in the environment. So we have low agreement here. If we had high consensus, other students also say that this particular class is boring, that's going to make us a lot more likely to believe that it's the class at fault and not the individual. And so if we go through all of these, consistency is always high for this example, but if we go through the top here, we're saying that, okay, high consistency, low distinctiveness, and low consensus. So Kim says all her classes are boring and the other students don't agree. Well, it's probably that this person has some kind of internal dispositional issue. So Kim is being overly critical. We're going to give it a personal attribution. This is this individual, their own internal state. If we go with the bottom, where we have high consistency, high distinctiveness, where this is the only class she has a problem with, and high consensus, other students agree that this class is also a problem, we're going to go with a situational attribution, something external. The class is probably boring because we have evidence that supports that. So in this situation, we're kind of weighting all of these other bits and pieces that go together. So if we're going to get a situational attribution, we're going to say that all three of our different qualities are high. For a personal attribution, consistency has to be high, so we know that it isn't a one-off situation, but we also need the other two to be low. Consensus and distinctiveness should be low for us to say that this is a personal or internal situation. And of course, this is great and all. This model works well if we have that time to sit down and critically consider these three options. If we sit down and go, okay, what do other people say? Let's consider that. What does she say about other situations? Let's consider that. Is this always the case? Let's mull over all of that information. Fine. But we also know at this point that people really rely on a lot of mental shortcuts. So we make a lot of very quick snap evaluations rather than thinking through things this thoroughly. So as nice as Kelly's model is, and as much as it would work if we thought that way, usually we're going to go with some gut instincts. It's probably not as consciously evaluated and probably a lot more internally assumed. And that's where we run into some of our biases. If we rely on some of these shortcuts, then of course we're going to have some biases because of those shortcuts. As per usual, if we look at that sort of fast processing where we use minimal resources and make a quick decision, we have to sacrifice some of that extra processing power, some of that extra thinking, the extra considerations. So we make assumptions, we jump to those conclusions, but we acknowledge there can be error, versus if we take a slow pathway, then we're burning through a lot more effort. It's a slower process, it takes us more time, but we're more sure that we're unbiased. But people tend to use that fast pathway as much as possible to try and conserve resources, because we can't really operate at full throttle all the time. But yeah, so this is where we get into our biases, our attributional biases, and the first of these is our fundamental attribution error. And so this is when we are explaining the behavior of others. So we'll look at our own biases because we tend to have a slightly different approach when we look at ourselves. But when we're explaining someone else's behavior, we tend to underestimate the impact of situational factors, and we tend to overestimate the role of personal factors. So we would be biased to blame that person for their own misfortune. So if Kim is complaining about this class, we are going to be a lot more likely to be like, you're just too critical, you're just complaining too much. Or if Jane is late for work, it's because she didn't plan ahead. She didn't set an alarm. This is a personal problem. So we tend to rely a lot more on this is something to do with who this person is as an individual. This is their internal fault, as opposed to focusing on the situation. There's a classic experiment done back in the 60s where Jones and Harris had students read sort of very precisely written speeches. And so these were assigned speeches. They were either pro or anti Fidel Castro, which was very relevant at the time. And they were told that it was written by a member of their debate team. And so they had some control, some manipulations here, where some of the students who read these either for or against speeches, some were told that the students who wrote the speech chose it freely. So this was their personal opinion, and some were told that they were assigned to be either for or against. And we wanted to see, well, how do we view this? And so we can actually flip to this next slide where we have this information that was given. So if we're told that they chose the topic or were assigned the topic, and we're saying, okay, was it a pro-Castro speech or an anti-Castro speech? So let's focus on the pro in the red here. If we're looking at this scale, we're basically saying the higher it is, the more people are saying that you support Castro. And so even in this situation, so with the chosen, we told you were chosen, so you're pro-Castro, that makes sense. But when they're assigned that role and they wrote a pro-Castro speech, people still assume that this is that person's opinion. We are blaming it or assigning it to that personality, that internal factor. We are saying that they are more pro-Castro, even though it was an assigned speech. Whereas if we look at the anti-Castro speech as our control, we're seeing that that's a much, much smaller number, saying that, yeah, when they wrote that anti-Castro speech, we're pretty sure that they are against him. And while, yeah, we did see a drop-off here, where they're not as strongly supporting in these people's opinion, it's still significantly higher than what the other individual was saying. Whereas if we had done a critical evaluation with no bias, when we're told that they were assigned one perspective or the other, we should say somewhere in the middle. We should be at, 50-50. We don't know if this person supports or not, because this was assigned and it gives us no relevant information on that person's beliefs. But because of our fundamental attribution error, we assume that that is related to that person, to that sort of internal disposition. So yeah, even when we were informed that the role was assigned, we still have that bias. So even when we're given information that would help us make a better decision, we still have that bias. Our situational information, assigned or not, was ignored in favor of having that personal or dispositional attribution instead. So that's really, really interesting that that happens, and that happens fairly consistently in a whole bunch of different iterations of this same type of study. Okay, and so with the fundamental attribution error, we're stressing that this applies to others, not to ourselves. So the reason why we're stressing this is because when we make attributions about our own motivations, we actually have a lot more information about what's going on within ourselves. We know why we're choosing to act a particular way. So I know that I wrote this speech because I was told to, not because I believe it. So maybe we have a little bit better of an interpretation of our own motivations. But when we look at others, they are sort of figures. They are individuals that are sort of being considered against us. So we are more of our background where the situation stands out to us. We care about the situational factors for ourselves, but for others, we more consider them their own figure, their own person, and the situation is less relevant or less applicable to them. And then, of course, people want to ask things like, well, is it inevitable to make this error? Is this fundamental bias or fundamental attribution bias / error? Is it inevitable? Is it something that we can overcome? And in fact, if we give people more time to think about it, or specifically, if we ask them questions that make them think critically about it, we can actually see that that error is reduced. That bias goes away if we ask pointed questions that force that critical thinking. So if we can force them out of that sort of fast gut response and into a more critical thought process, we can reduce this process here. But if we want another example of that comparison of ourselves versus others, I had an example given to me that is, think about driving down the street. So if you are driving along and you are stuck behind someone who's going too slow, you might think that they're a moron. This person doesn't know how to drive. They are going so slowly. Why can't they do the speed limit? Why aren't they moving faster? whereas a fast driver is a maniac because they're up on my bumper and I'm going as fast as I can. So you're framing it versus your own perspective. But if we consider it, that fast driver is up behind us just like we were on the slow driver versus our comparison. So in this situation, we use ourselves as our own frame of reference. So we are comparing others to us, and we interpret their behaviors relative to me as the person who's doing everything right. But everybody is going to be doing their own behaviors relative to themselves, so we kind of need to consider that as well. We are our own reference point, just as others are their own reference points. And then I found this was kind of an interesting other little sort of experiment and discussion, which was when we start looking at this fundamental attribution error and sort of seeing it out in the world, people tend to use this or apply this where they conflate actors and the roles that they play. Where people who are, say, famous for playing villains, people might dislike them because they dislike the characters that they play. Or if we have the example here of Leonard Nimoy, who is playing Spock, who is very logical and critical and analyzing and non-emotional, people tended to assume that he himself, the actor, would also have those traits. So because we have this problem of trying to separate out sort of our observations and the situation of they are acting from the personal attributions of I've seen this person be unemotional and cold, we assume that that's the actor themselves' personality, ignoring the situation of they are acting in this scene. So we can kind of see it actually play a role here as well, which is kind of cool. And then, of course, when we get into explaining our own behavior, we have a different kind of bias, and this is the self-serving bias. And this, of course, has its own complexity, but when we're considering our own behaviors, we tend to have more personal attributions for successes. I did well because I am a great person. I aced that test because I'm smart. I succeeded. I got that job because I'm the best candidate. All these good things happen because I'm the best. Whereas if something goes wrong, if we have a failure, we are putting it all on the situation. I failed the test because the teacher wasn't fair, because the questions were too hard. I didn't get the job because somebody is out to get me, or I wasn't given a fair evaluation. But this also depends dramatically on our psychological state, where this reverses for individuals with depression. So people with depression will blame the situation or credit the situation if they succeed. I only did well on the test because the teacher was too easy. It wasn't me doing anything good, so I'm not giving myself any credit. But if something goes wrong, it's all your own fault. So having those sort of different psychological frameworks actually can have a dramatic effect on that, which is very, very interesting. And I don't know that we've made this distinction quite yet, but the difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures is usually fairly important when it comes to evaluations of culture in psychology. And the way that, or I guess the first is the definition of these. In individualistic cultures, individuals tend to focus on themselves. So when they're looking for sort of what are you? So if we ask them to give a descriptor, so we say list 5 characteristics that describe you, they're usually going to describe something about themselves. So some personality trait, what their job is, something about who they are as an individual. Whereas with collectivist cultures, they're more focused not on the individual, but on the community as a whole. And so if you ask individuals from a collectivist culture to describe themselves, they'll usually give you characteristics that put them in context within their environment. So they'll say something like, I am an oldest child, or I am a father, or I am a caregiver, something that puts them in that context with others. And so these sort of distinctions here mean that these individuals from these different types of cultures have different kinds of priorities and different ways of framing things. And so interestingly, our individualistic cultures are typically going to be our Western cultures. So North America and Western Europe would fall into that bracket. So typically when we talk about individualistic cultures, that's where the research has been conducted. And we've also mentioned before, I believe, that a lot of psychology research has a bias towards this Western bias, simply because that's where a lot of English literature is produced, and therefore that's mostly what's studied and then represented in the literature. So even our textbooks have a very heavy Western bias, meaning that most of the findings that are presented and a lot of the theories we talk about are focused on individualistic cultures. And so we typically don't include the alternative of collectivist cultures unless we're in the section of that chapter where we start saying, hey, how does this carry across different cultures? And that's when we start integrating the collectivist cultures as well. So I usually like to point this bias out because it's not just in this particular attribution research, it's literally in all types of psychology research. So it's one of those things that if you study in North America, most of your textbooks are based on North American research. Maybe if they're going a little bit further afield, you'll get a little bit of Western European, but not much, and it's very, very rare to get a good representation of stuff conducted in other countries. So we have to keep that limitation in mind. But beyond that, if we actually want to get into our differences here, most of what we've talked about so far, surprise, surprise, is about our individualistic cultures. So individualistic cultures have a lot more of their personal attributions. So I'm more likely to blame somebody on their individual personality, those dispositional attributions, if something is going wrong. So if they're late for work or if they do a poor job, I'm going to blame it on them as a person. And that's probably because of that focus on individualism. Though we do also still have that bias, that self-serving bias, where we're very reluctant to take sort of our own blame if something goes wrong. And it's possibly, again, tied into this whole my identity is related to who I am as an individual. And so anything that threatens that perception is therefore a bad thing. So they would try and deflect the blame to the situation rather than damage their self-identity. So that's kind of standing with what we've already talked about. But if we look at our collectivist cultures, and just for example, so this would be places like India, I think Japan is another big one where they'll talk about this, and we'll talk specifically about some studies done in East Asian countries. But in these collectivist cultures, they take a lot more personal responsibility for failures. And if we tie this into that more holistic part of a group perspective, they're basically wanting to say, if I did something wrong that's hurting my group, I'm taking the blame for it. I'm going to remove any blame on my environment, on the others around me, and I will take responsibility so that nobody else is put out. So it's the focus on the greater good instead of the individual. And so in these situations, yeah, we get a higher situational attribution for others in these collectivist cultures for bad things. So we don't want to blame others for bad things. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt because we are sort of looking at that greater good of the group. So if there's a personal attribution, it's usually for yourself to take blame off of others. And if there's something that someone else has done wrong, it's usually you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And yeah, when we look at a lot of the East Asian countries, when they've done a lot of these studies, there's a lot of different possibilities that are usually considered. So instead of these sort of shortcuts, these biases that we've been talking about, they tend to take a more complex or holistic perspective. So instead of just having that gut response of it's the person or it's the situation, they tend to actually do a more thorough evaluation. And that might have something to do with some of the beliefs held in those areas where they tend to have a lot more holistic thinking. They tend to take things a little bit slower and tend not to rush in making judgments. So that might allow for more of that critical evaluation. And yeah, so that's the theory there at least. But I'm sure you can tell that is an entire area of study and we get exactly 2 points on it. So that's all we get to say. For our next section, we're going to look at forming and maintaining impressions. So we know that we interact with a lot of people on a daily basis. It's pretty common, but we don't really have access to anything about those individuals other than whatever is presented at the time. And a lot of times we interact with people without really getting that chance for a deeper conversation. So we have to make some snap judgments, maybe some assumptions, just from our first impressions of interacting with these individuals. So yeah, we have to sort of determine what kind of a person they are and choose how we want to act towards them based on the situation, how they look, the behaviors we get to observe, and whatever other factors we can glean information from. So one thing we want to acknowledge is, yeah, there's definitely a primacy effect here. And we've mentioned primacy and recency effects when it comes to memorizing lists, where the primacy effect is you remember the first few things on the list because they were said first, and therefore they stick in your mind. Same basic idea here, where a first impression, the first bits of information you glean about a person, tends to stick in your mind a little bit more intensely than the following information. So if you got a particular feeling from somebody the first time you met them, that's going to end up influencing sort of your future perceptions of them. So we typically end up attaching a lot more importance to that initial information because when we get it, we don't have any other information. Over time, we can kind of dilute it out and pick up more and more information as we have more and more experience. But to begin with, so that's going to take a lot of precedence. We're going to give it a lot of weight. And we tend to be a lot more alert to the information that we received first. So if somebody's introducing a friend and they give you a list of all of their characteristics, usually the stuff that they say at the beginning of the list is what we typically assume is the most important about that person. So if they're introduced as being nice and funny and an athlete and they have cats, you're probably going to focus on the, okay, so this is a nice, funny person. Whereas if they started with something else, maybe you start with the athlete, maybe we assume that's a greater part of their personality. So maybe they come across as a stereotypical jock, and that's why it was listed first, was because it came to mind first. So we start making these little assumptions because we have very little information to go on, and we're trying to decide what's important. And of course, as humans, we really like to rely on those schemas, those shortcuts, those little sort of boxes that we've created of different concepts to try and categorize people very quickly so we know how to interact with them successfully. And we also want to keep in mind that the initial information that we gather can actually end up shaping how we perceive subsequent information. So if you were told that this person is this way, you're going to be interpreting what they do in the light of that information. So if you're told that this person is really shy, and when you meet with them, they don't interact with you much, you're going to be like, oh, okay, they're shy, so I'm not too concerned. They didn't interact with me because it's really hard for them to talk to others. But if you were told that this person is cold or really hard to interact with, you might interpret it as, oh yeah, no, they're definitely like a really cold person. They were really rude. I don't like them. So the information that you're given, that first impression, can really shape what happens downstream. And this does kind of set up that, oh man, what if I make a bad first impression, like all is lost? That's not actually the case. As per usual, the first information is weighted fairly heavily, but if we have new information, and especially if that new information is consistent, and if it goes against what we started with, you can start changing that impression. So it's not set in stone, it's just our starting point, and if we need to, we can change those impressions with time and experience. It just takes a little bit more effort. So we almost have to work harder to make that happen. But yeah, so we want to keep that in mind. And of course, we can talk about why this might happen. Why do we put so much importance on those early determinations? And we can, of course, go back and tell some evolutionary story about it, where if you're only interacting with someone briefly, something important like, is this a good ally or a potential threat, that early information is really, really important for things like survival. Nowadays, it's a lot different. It's, I will be friends with this person or I will not be friends with this person, but it's kind of it. In the past, though, it definitely would have had that evolutionary natural selection push to it. And of course, this is all that sort of gut response. This is us taking those shortcuts, using the limited information that we have. But if we are reminded that we need to be careful in our assessments, if we need to avoid making a snap judgment, if we need to think about this carefully, having that awareness drawn to, focus on this and pay attention, we can actually shift away from the importance of these initial impressions. So if we are consciously told not to make a first impression, we're actually really good at then critically evaluating it and weighting all the information equally. So it's again more of that if we're forced to, we can actually be good at this, but we by default will rely on some of our built-in mechanisms. Okay, and so some of the ideas here that we want to bring into play are things like a mental set. So a mental set is basically our readiness to see the world a particular way. So this is like that warning of, hey, this person is shy, or hey, that person is really cold and calculating. So that's setting us up with a certain set of assumptions to match what we've been told. So we can be sort of predisposed or primed to expect certain things to occur. We've been given a particular mental set. And our mental sets are usually made up of a series of schemas and other types of frameworks. So we've mentioned before, a schema is like our mental framework where we're trying to organize and interpret information in the most efficient way possible. I like to think of schemas as our little shortcuts. So this is the stuff that I've learned works this way, and so the next time I encounter similar information, I can skip all of the thought and the thinking and the processing that went into it last time, and I'll jump to the same conclusion this time too. We can be shown that our schemas may be incorrect, but as long as they work well enough, we can maintain them. And as we get older and as we have more experience, we just build up more schemas, more shortcuts. And then we can end up with our stereotypes. So stereotypes at the bottom, and we'll come back to stereotypes a little bit later on, because stereotypes end up leading into other things like prejudice and discrimination. But for stereotypes on their own, the term as we're using it here is just a generalized belief about a particular group or a particular category. So on its own, a stereotype isn't technically a bad thing. It's, again, one of those mental shortcuts where we're saying from experience, people in this category, so we mentioned before athletes. So if I mention athletes, you might have a mental image of what does a typical athlete act like? What other hobbies might they have? How might they dress? Those assumptions that come to mind are part of your stereotype of athletes. And as long as that's a fairly accurate representation, as long as you are just sort of making a general category, that isn't really problematic. It will later become problematic if you start using those assumptions to start making determinations and acting upon them. So as long as we don't have any negative connotations and we're not doing anything bad with the information, a stereotype can actually be very, very useful. So this is one of those things like, hey, I teach, say, 1,000 students in a semester. And so I might have a bunch of stereotypes about, hey, this is a class of first-year students. Here's how they probably act. That might be helpful because I'm going to speak to them at a particular level for psychology in first year, because from experience, that's the level that they're at. If I then encounter an individual who is in that class, but is actually a higher level student, maybe they're a third-year student and this is an elective, I can adjust accordingly because now I have more information on that one individual. But the stereotype was really useful for treating a larger group. Again, not with any kind of judgment or discrimination or anything like that, but just a framework to work from until more information is presented. So this can be a really powerful and useful type of schema, but can also end up being problematic. And there's actually a couple of interesting studies. So to see the power of this, there's one iteration of this study where they have a video of a young girl, and half of the people who are shown this video are told that this young girl is from an upper middle class family. The other half of individuals are told that she is from a poorer family, a lower class family. And then the individuals are all shown the exact same video. The only thing that differs is the socioeconomic status that they assume and any stereotypes that come along with that. And then after seeing the video, these participants are asked to evaluate the child's academic potential. And they will score her potential as being significantly less if they were told she was from a poorer background. And this is done consistently. Same thing goes if you're told that, oh, this is a gifted child versus a problem child. Seeing the exact same behavior but with a different framework, you're going to interpret those behaviors differently. And so just by having that activation of a certain type of framework, a certain schema or stereotype, we can have very different interpretations of literally identical information. So that is why we think it's, or why we know it's such a powerful concept and something that we're usually told to be very aware of and sort of willing to change if we can. Kind of tying to that idea that I was saying before, that advanced warning of, hey, this person is shy or this person is cold, those bits of information can actually end up creating what we call self-fulfilling prophecies. So if we have an expectation based on either our own first impressions or on somebody else's heads up, our expectations can actually affect how we behave towards someone. So if you're told that someone is shy, or I guess let's go with the negative example. We'll go with, because I have it on here as a negative example. So if we start at the beginning here, we have an expectation that this guy, George, is unfriendly. He's cold. So because we go in and anticipate a cold and unfriendly individual, we are going to behave cold and unfriendly to them to protect ourselves. We don't want to spend a bunch of time being warm and cozy and friendly with this individual who's not a nice person, so I'm going to be pretty detached. I'm going to go in and just do the bare minimum. Because I've now acted coldly towards them, they're going to probably act equally cold back. And by doing so, he's acting in an unfriendly fashion, which matches exactly what I expected. So in this instance, we don't actually know if this person was cold or not, but they have acted cold because our expectations influenced our actions and our actions influenced theirs. So in a lot of situations, what we expect or what we sort of anticipate can end up shaping what actually ends up happening, hence the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we end up creating exactly what we had anticipated encountering in that situation. All right, so that was part 2. Like I said, this chapter is a lot more snappy than the earlier ones. Part 3 is when we start looking at social influence. So this is leaning into that idea that people are influenced by others. So it's not just us making attributions of others' actions or just us what were we just doing? Oh, we were just having expectations and looking at sort of how we act in those situations. We also have to acknowledge that having other people around can cause us to behave in different ways. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that can go on here. So the first of these things here is the mere presence of others. And this basically says that having other people around can cause us to behave differently. As a researcher, this is a huge problem because people tend to change their actions. So for example, if we're conducting a study and people think they know what it is we're studying, they might change their behavior to try and match what they think they want us to do. So in this situation, if we don't sort of keep people in the dark, if we don't have a proper blinded study, and people assume that, hey, I'm in the group that's supposed to be extra kind because of this, they're going to sort of lean into that. They're going to be more kind than they would have acted normally. And now that kindness is not from our manipulation, but because they're trying to match what they think we want. So just having extra people around can screw up your results because we try and change our behaviors to match expectations. You can also have people who will try and do the opposite just to mess with you, and then it's also not good because you're getting then extremes on both sides, and then your data has lots of outliers. But in a more simplistic form, if you think about it, does your behavior change if you are around your friends, or your siblings, or your boss at work? So the presence of different people from different parts of your life can change your behavior in different ways. So you tend to match your behavior based on who's around. And if we look at things like performance on particular tasks, you can actually have your performance either enhanced or hindered depending on what kind of a task it is. So if we were looking at, say, teenage boys, and we're trying to get them to run a certain distance as fast as they can, having their friends around, they might perform much, much better because they want to show just how strong they are for their friends. Or if they're asked to do something like score really well on this test, or do a really nice painting, and their friends might look down on them for that, they might underperform to match those expectations. So yeah, we see a lot of these shifts in how people end up acting depending on the environment, the social environment that they're in. Yes. And then we look at something here called social facilitation. And this is basically the idea that if we're in a situation, especially where others are present and others might be maybe stressing us out, we might be so worried about how we look in that situation that we might default to our dominant response. So we're going to go with our gut instinct because we're so flustered by having other people there and other people watching us that we're just going to go with whatever pops into our head first. And if this is a fairly easy task, then usually your gut response is going to be the correct one. But if it's a really complex task, it usually requires a lot more finesse than just see what happens. So we can see it facilitating easy tasks, but it might actually inhibit our performance on harder tasks. Our next concept, before we get into our social norms on the next slide, I actually have a note here that says, don't forget to mention social roles. And this is something where we can kind of tie it into some of these ideas of, hey, how do you act when you're around your friends, or how do you act when you're around your parents or around your coworkers? Because our social roles are going to be a set of norms or sort of framework of rules that characterize how we're supposed to act under certain conditions. So if you're around your friends, there are certain expectations from your friends that set your role within that group. As an instructor, that I have certain aspects of my social role that influence how I end up behaving in a classroom. So I am in the teaching role, I'm sharing information, I probably don't swear all that much, and I'm going to be speaking at sort of whatever level of understanding is appropriate for the class that I'm in. So right before this, I teach a 300 level class, and we talk about specific brain areas that are involved in different aspects of perception. I definitely don't end up doing that here, where we end up on a more broad, basic exposure because we're working up to that. So all of these things end up influencing us. And we can have lots of different roles. So you can have a role as a parent, as a student, as a sibling, as a friend, and they're all going to influence how you are supposed to act in a particular situation. And that ties us into our social norms. And these are a bunch of shared expectations about how we should be thinking and feeling and behaving based on the people around us. So yeah, we end up changing our behavior quite a lot based on all of these different aspects. And the social norms that we have, these assumptions of what is the correct way to behave, they end up regulating our behavior without much awareness. One of the quickest ways to actually get that feeling of a social norm is, have you ever gotten into an elevator and had somebody get in with you and stand really, really close to you, even though there's tons of space and no one else there? That feeling is that they have violated the social norm of you're supposed to spread out in an elevator. If you want to give someone else that feeling, get in an elevator facing the wrong way and just watch the panic in their eyes, because it's a violation of our expectations. And it's not something we usually talk about, so people are like, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought of that if you mention it in class. But there are tons of these norms, something like even looking at how people sit in the classroom. With lots of vacant seats, having somebody come in and sit right next to you is gonna be weird. And you can't quite describe why it's weird, but it's weird because it's violating these expectations, these social norms. And we learn most of these through exposure, through experience, where you watch how other people tend to sit in the classroom or how other people tend to get on an elevator, and you sort of absorb those through experience as you grow up. And of course, these change between cultures. So typically in North America, getting on an elevator, you are usually going to stand as far apart as possible, and you typically don't really talk to the other person. Maybe, especially in Canada, you do the sort of head nod to acknowledge their presence, and then you move on from there. But in other cultures, I think I think it's in Sweden or somewhere around there, getting in the elevator, it is expected that you engage in small talk with the person in the elevator. You're supposed to acknowledge them, ask them how their day is going, talk about the weather, and if you don't, it's considered rude. But for us, that would be awful because you're not supposed to do that. I experience this every time I go home to Nova Scotia because my parents live in a small community and Nova Scotians are way too friendly. But if you drive through the neighborhood, everyone waves at you, whether you know them or not. And so for me, it feels really weird to have tons of people like full waving as you drive by and you know nothing about them. But if you're there for long enough, you find yourself driving through the neighborhood and lifting your hand as you go, which coming back here, if you do that, you will get very dirty looks very, very quickly. So these norms have sort of some localizations where they apply, but they apply to everything. So there's lots and lots of ways these can happen. Oh, and apparently I had a slide for social roles. I just put my notes early. But yeah, so we talked about the social roles already, but we can actually sometimes run into, the extra part here, role conflict. So this is when we might have different social roles, so student, daughter, son, whatever it is that you are, coworker, all of these different roles have different expectations. If the norms for each of those different roles end up clashing, you can end up with some anxiety, some role conflict. So one of the best examples of this is, okay, well, what if you have your friend group at home, and so you're with your parents where you're supposed to act a certain way, but your friends are also there and you act a certain way with your friends. So what happens? Which of those roles ends up taking precedence? And so it can be really, really weird because your friends might be like, why are you acting so strangely? Or you might end up getting in trouble from your parents because you're acting how your friends expect you to. This is why one of those things where you kind of take on a role when you're at a certain place. So I find sometimes encountering friends or colleagues or whatever at school is very different than meeting them elsewhere. But yeah, so in this situation, if we have sort of different roles and different norms for each of those roles, we can end up exhibiting uncharacteristic behavior in front of certain people if we are currently trying to fulfill a role that they are not used to experiencing. So if I've actually had, so my parents, the first time I started teaching, my parents flew out and they sat in on one of my lectures, and they remember me as that kid who used to cry before I'd have to give presentations at school, and I'd get like the shaky voice if I had to make a phone call, and they sat in on me lecturing to 400 students in one of the big lecture halls at the U of A, and so my mother cried the entire lecture, so I had to explain that to my students, but she was sort of like, oh my gosh, you were like a completely different person, because it's a different role. So they saw me in my old role, but as an instructor, you sort of have a different approach. But yeah, so it looks like uncharacteristic behavior to that individual, but it's just a difference in roles. Okay, and we kind of mentioned the fact that a lot of these roles, a lot of these social customs, these social norms that we have, they're fairly arbitrary. Do you talk to people in the elevator or not? It's kind of all about the local convention. What's the normal thing to happen here? Hence the name. And these tend to change with time and with location and all of these other things. So as stuff changes, so whether it's changing in the society or globally or whatever, we start to see some shifts in expectations for different roles. So one of the biggest examples of this is that the roles for women have changed fairly dramatically in the last century. So we go from, housewives and sort of taking care of a family and being at home, to it's now acceptable to have a career, to sort of push away from that previous role, and now there's sort of less restrictions on what you can and cannot do. And yeah, it changes, as we said, across cultures as well. But one of the things that we want to consider is that we kind of need to have some kind of agreement on what is acceptable or not acceptable. And a lot of this determination of what is normal or not normal is actually run without intention, without conscious thought. So we usually learn, what are you supposed to do in an elevator? Or how do I behave in a classroom, just from watching what's going on around you. But it's very rare to have written sets of rules that tell you exactly what you should or should not do. But yeah, there can be more explicit statements, or you might find that if you act against these norms, somebody might call you out on it. And it's sometimes hard to put into words why it's wrong, but they will tell you that it is wrong and you have to adjust. But this works for sort of larger scale things like cultures, or it might be something as small scale as a small group of friends. Each of those different types of groups can have their own sets of norms. And like we've shown, it can apply to pretty much anything. So you might find that you talk to one group of friends a particular way and you talk to a different group of friends a slightly different way. That's because those two separate groups have slightly different sets of norms. And they all overlap and intersect in a very complex way. And just sort of another of the sort of trying to remember. So this is another, like where I was mentioning before, talking about separating our actors from their roles. This was another example that one of my textbooks had given with the movie $1 Million Baby, which was basically showing that the shift in what is acceptable for women to do has shifted over time, where when this movie was taking place, it was unheard of to have a woman as a boxer and trying to pursue a career in that area, whereas nowadays there are entire leagues of boxing devoted to both sexes. So that's something that has shifted pretty dramatically, but that shift is happening at different rates in different countries. So there are still some places where this would still be unheard of or against the social norms, and other places where it would be perfectly fine.